conservatives aren't good at making art. They're not funny, they're not creative, they're not witty. That's why
I have been filmmaking for the past 8 years. I have directed short projects as well as music videos and some commercials. And generally speaking, the number one question that conservatives and Christians ask me is, why aren't there good conservative films? And essentially the answer is that conservatives are at a disadvantage due to their ideology and their perspective, or lack thereof. Because a great deal of conservatives aren't trying to make art that asks a question. They are trying to make art that leads a viewer to a very specific answer. And unfortunately, that's how you get vanity pieces, that's how you get propaganda. That's how you get films that are either not very well thought out, that are heavily contrived or poorly written, or films that simply do not age very well. Say, for instance, you're a conservative and you're trying to make a conservative take on a historical event, such as the Civil War. So you make Gods and Generals. However, Gods and Generals largely used lost cause rhetoric to tell its story. And if you study lost cause rhetoric, if you study the Civil War itself, the truth is objectively not conservative. The South didn't care about states' rights because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which superseded states' rights so they could pursue slaves in non-slave owning states. You have the fact that Robert E. Lee was not a generous and kind man. He kept his slaves when he didn't have to. And there's the fact that the South was not an idealistic place to live. That's the problem with a lot of conservatives with historical dramas. They can't make good, compelling historical dramas because they ultimately reject the reality of the history back then. Another conservative film that I like to bring up is God's Not Dead. God's Not Dead did very well in 2014 when it was released. However, it is depicting a debate between whether or not God is real. And because it's made by Christians, they fundamentally cannot provide any actual valid points for why God wouldn't exist, because that would risk them actually either alienating their Christian audience or potentially causing people to question God's existence. So it's incredibly contrived. Even from the get-go, all the arguments are just made in very poor taste. A lot of atheists are misrepresented, and for that reason, it's just not a very compelling film to watch. In contrast to this, think about John Carpenter's The Thing, or think about 2011's The Sound of My Voice. Both films which do not provide clear conclusions, but simply provide you with situations where you might wonder, who would I be in this situation? What kind of person am I? And that's much more compelling and much stronger than simply a film telling you, if you're not this person, then you're wrong. This is such a common thread with conservative films. They are not willing to do enough introspection or gain enough understanding about something to provide a valid or interesting or compelling perspective or criticism on any type of subject matter. And this is so prevalent throughout conservative films. Another example I like to bring up is 2023's Lady Ballers. It's supposed to be a comedy, sure, but comedy is always more interesting if it's a punch up, not a punch down, and if it comes from a position of understanding. Someone who understands your culture and roasts it is always more funny than someone who doesn't understand your culture and simply roasts a stereotype about you. But essentially, the premise of Lady Ballers is that it's about men who pretend to be trans women so they can play women's sports, and it's supposed to be funny in the process. However, when you actually study the film, you'll find out that it was supposed to be a documentary until they couldn't find anyone who was actually willing to transition in order to play women's sports, which completely defeated its original premise, and yet they still made a film anyways. How is that going to be compelling if they are not willing to understand what they're trying to make fun of? If they are ultimately being ignorant, it's not going to be comedic. The truth of the matter is that these films will slip through the cracks of time and they will be forgotten because they don't provide any interesting insights, they don't provide any new perspectives. A lot of them are rehashes of older plots, and it's not really compelling because it doesn't come from a position of understanding. If you're conservative and you want to make a film that people will still watch 100 years from now, it has to stand the test of time, which means that at its core, it needs to provide insight into truth. At its core, it needs to be able to generate an emotional response from an audience, as opposed to simply leading them to believe what you already believe. That is just propaganda. And really great films ask a question. They don't provide answers. That's how it works.